Welcome to Americana Archives. Today's headline is Nevada's Wonderful Cave. The subheadlines say, Millions upon millions of pure gold and silver. This article originally appeared in the Virginia Enterprise. It's reported from Carson, Nevada on November 27th. It says, for many years, there's been living in the Walker River range of mounds a man named Algernon B. Grant, who very rarely sought the haunts or habitations of white men. His ostensible occupation was prospecting for precious metals, but the fact of his long and uninterrupted residence in these wilds pointed to the fact of his non-success in that direction. Mr. Grant was in this city a few days since, and the following is an extract from his wonderful and interesting history. He is a native of Bourbon County, Kentucky, having been born there in 1825. He was sent to Harvard College, where he graduated in 1846, second in his class. In 1851, he was admitted to practice in the Supreme Court of Kentucky. He enjoyed a lucrative practice in that city until the breaking out of the rebellion when he entered the Confederate service, receiving a commission as major in one of the Kentucky regiments. In the meantime, Grant had married and gathered a little family around him. These he at the time had taken to the southern portion of Kentucky and placed them under the protection of relatives. When the war ended, he pictured to himself in rapturous delight the happiness that would fall to his lot when he could once again gaze upon the faces of his loving wife and dear children. He took passage for southern Kentucky. Upon arriving at the spot where his hopes and happiness had been centered, there awaited him nothing but a mass of charred ruins. The strong man dismounted from his horse and sat down upon the ground, weeping like a child. He learned that about a year before the close of the war, a small band of straggling troops had infested that portion of Kentucky, and that the family of Grant had been murdered and the incendiary torch was brought into play. In the early spring of 1866, he engaged passage in a mule train which was then about crossing the plains, and afterward arrived in this state, and emigrated to the most extreme southern end of the Walker River Mountains, where he has been existing ever since, only at rare intervals seeing the detested face of a white man. A number of the Walker River tribe looked up to the man with great reverence, supposing him to be endowed with supernatural powers. About 2 months ago, one of these Indians, who had been a recipient of special favors at the hands of Grant, desirous of exhibiting his gratitude, requested our hero to accompany him on a 2 days' ramble through the mountains, and he would show him a cave wonderfully rich with gold and silver. What direction of the compass the party followed, Grant is reluctant about revealing. At all events, after traveling about 2 days and a half, our hero and his companion arrived at dusk one evening in a narrow canyon or mountain gorge, enclosed on either side by rugged, steep mounds. In this vicinity, the Indians said the cave was located. A campfire was lighted, and while Grant was cooking supper, his companion went in search of the exact location of the cave, so that no time would be lost in finding it in the morning. The Indian returned with joy imprinted upon his copper-colored features, and imparted to Grant the satisfactory tidings that he had found the cave without difficulty, and that notwithstanding the darkness which then prevailed, the interior of this wonderful vault was as light as noonday. At an early hour next morning, after traveling in this canyon, which is many miles in length, for an hour or maybe a little less, the Indian pointed to a pile of granite of immense weight, stacked up against the cragged side of a monster mound, and told Grant that by removing the boulders an entrance to the cave could be effected. The two men immediately set to work at their Herculean task, which occupied nearly 2 hours. When the obstruction was removed, all that could be seen was an opening leading into the mound, of dimensions only great enough to admit the bodies of two largely developed men. But the interior was as dark as Erebus. Grant ventured into the opening to the distance of about 10 feet, but the intensity of the darkness precluded him from seeing his hands before his face. He cried out to his companion for some burning sagebrush, which was immediately thrust into the cave. But strange to relate, this artificial light would not illuminate the darkness. Here was a nice pass. Grant emerged from his subterranean visit and consulted with his semi-savage companion as to the most expedient means to be employed in the emergency. It was useless to seek for gold or anything else in so dark a place, where artificial light proved of no avail. The Indian then repeated his story of the illumination which he saw in the cave the preceding night. Although this yarn sounded rather improbable in the ears of an intelligent white man, yet the Indian was so earnest and sincere to all outward appearances that our hero decided to remain until the stars came out, and determine whether there was any truth in his companion's fabulous narration. The men returned to the camping ground of the previous night and brought their traps to the mouth of the mysterious cave. It seemed as if that day would never draw to a close, so great was Grant's impatience. But as twilight was approaching, a slight glimmer was discernible at the mouth of the vault, yet the blackest darkness mortal ever beheld was still holding sway therein. But gradually, as night was falling, an unnatural light was making itself apparent, and at 9 o'clock that evening, a ray of brilliant noonday light shot out from the opening of that wonderful subterranean passage. For the first time in many years, Grant gave vent to a shout of delight. The Indian's tale of seeming fiction and improbability was true. The sight was so grand, so wonderful, and so magnificent that for a few moments Grant was rooted to the ground by a combination of terror and admiration. After a while, he and companion entered the cave, but the light was so piercing and brilliant that for a few seconds the pair could see nothing. Their vision seemed to be lost, but gradually their eyes became accustomed to the unnatural brilliancy of the light, and the sight which met their gaze no person can depict. The walls and ceiling of the passage were covered with burnished gold and silver, the bulk of which comprised thousands of tons. Grant relates that the first sight of these treasures terrified him, but after regaining his self-possession, he and the Indian made a tour of exploration. This cave is about 1 mile in length, 150 feet in width, and 70 feet high. The interior of this immense grotto is arched similar to an old Gothic church, supported by large alabaster-like pillars, entwined by heavy golden and silver wire of the dimensions of a man's finger, like the growth of ivy, and in a style of grandeur and magnificence that could never be produced by human hands. These pillars seem to have been placed in position by a provident nature to support the heavy ceilings of the grotto, encrusted by thousands of tons of gold and silver wire and ingots wrought into the most fantastic shapes. Besides the incalculable treasures, this vast cave contains chambers and domes of the most grotesque architectural designs, marvelous avenues and little lakes, the latter alive with fish of every color of the rainbow. A gorgeous and indescribable sight indeed. This all reads like an improbable tale, but Grant vows that his statement is one of absolute veracity, from alpha to omega. One of the most unaccountable features about this cave is the unnatural light at night, which Grant says is not phosphorescent, he being somewhat of a scientist, and the unheard of and impenetrable darkness during the day. Grant asserts that there are millions upon millions of pure gold and silver in that vault, and he means to share them with those who have been kind to him in bygone days. He is now en route for Louisville, Kentucky, and has with him several hundred pounds of gold taken from the cave to seek out some of his old friends, whom he will bring out here as early as possible. This story came from the great state of Indiana, being reported in The People of December 15th, 1877. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.